Let's go!
So I wanted to do a video looking at A Plague Tale: Innocence. This is a game that is just out, it's just been released. And it's one that I've been looking forward to a great deal. I missed the original announcement of it, I think, so I haven't been looking forward to it for too long. But as the previews and the developer diaries and all that kind of stuff started to roll in, it seemed like a really interesting game to me, and it seemed like the kind of thing that I really should love, so I was really keen to see how it turned out. So in A Plague Tale: Innocence, you play as a young 14-year-old girl who finds herself in a pretty bad spot. She's the naive and kind of sheltered daughter of a noble family at a time where humanity was going through one of its worst periods. It's the period of the Inquisition, plus the Black Death, plus the 100 Years' War. So it was not a good time to be a person in Europe at this particular point in time. And this girl finds herself on a journey in which she needs to protect her little brother, her even younger brother, who is also quite sick, and somehow escape all the horrors and disasters that were going on at the period of time. Now, on the very surface of it, that's an absolutely brilliant idea for a game because it should work, or could work, on so many different levels. On the very basic level, it works as an emotional story because it is these two young people, these two young family members, set against some of the greatest atrocities and horrors of human history. And they still have that family bond, and they need to connect as brother and sister and all that kind of thing, it's an interesting contrast, and the game does an absolutely brilliant job of really highlighting the horrors of the time. It doesn't flinch. Some of the imagery in here is quite affecting and quite brutal, but it needed to be. It needs to shock you in order to push its emotional message through, and I think the developers have done an absolutely brilliant job of that. I think they've done an absolutely brilliant job of the setting, the characterization, the small little interactions between the two characters is really impressive, and it's a very emotional game. So on that level, the developers have absolutely succeeded. The game also works as a kind of coming-of-age story because at the start of the game, the girl is presented as being very young, very naive, completely responsibility-free, but she needs to develop the capacity to take responsibility for things. She needs to grow up very quickly in this dark and hostile world, and the game does a good job of showing that arc. There are moments where you'll be playing and you'll think to yourself that she doesn't really behave like or sound like a 14-year-old. But then you'll also remember that back then people didn't have the luxury of being children until they were 17, 18, 19 years old, if not later in a lot of cases. Back then, by the time you were 14 or 15, you really did need to start behaving like an adult because you were certainly going to start to be treated like one. She gets away with it a little bit at the start because she is a noble woman. She comes from a noble family, and therefore she's sheltered to an extent, but certainly the rest of the population through this period of history, they had no such luxuries, and 14 was not really a child back then. So I think the game's done a good job of really kind of balancing out that naivety that they wanted to present in the girl. They wanted her to be young, and that's an important part of the character development, but at the same time they needed to show the realities of the time and the fact that children back then were defined very differently to how they are now. So I think that as a coming-of-age story, this game works, and it gives you some nice insights into the history of the time. The developers have really worked hard to get that history right, in fact. You'll pick up little things as you play along, which kind of give you hints about culture at the time, and each one of those little things, they're kind of the unlockable treasures that you need to scour the environments for, in other words. But each of those little treasures that you'll pick up has a little description which just fills in, gives you an insight into what the history of the time was like. So I think the developers have got all of that right as well. Finally, the game kind of works on a philosophical level as well, because it takes place during a time in which there was a lot of the worst of humanity that was coming out. The Black Death was causing people to be very xenophobic, and not just towards people from outside of town, but even their next door neighbours. There was all kinds of fear about people getting sick from one another, and it was pretty justified fear given that it was wiping out 30, 40, 50% of towns and cities across all of Europe. It's also a time where the Inquisition was at its most powerful, and the Inquisition did all kinds of things that would absolutely horrify us today, but that's what they were doing. And it was a time during the 100 Years' War, which was this massive conflict between England and France, which had such a massive impact on everybody that it touched. So on those three levels, the game really works. It works as an emotional story. It works as a coming-of-age story for the girl, so it has a intense characterization for a single individual as well. And it works on a philosophical level. It certainly has that question, is the real enemy the rats or is it the humans? And the game explicitly asks that question. So it's not hiding it. It's not exactly the most subtle of games, but it's a game that is consistently intriguing and has a strong story to tell and gets that story out in a very impressive way. So in terms of a storytelling experience, I do think A Plague Tale delivered, and it was more than enough to keep me playing through, and I really struggled to put the controller down. So on that level, it really works. Unfortunately, the developers also clearly felt a great deal of pressure to make their story, make their experience that they'd crafted into a video game, and that kind of lets it down because it becomes too gamey for its own good. It starts off really, really strong. The first couple of chapters, the first 5 or 6 chapters even, it's really, really strong in terms of the balance between the gameplay bits, the narrative bits, and the way that the gameplay is part of the narrative. But as the game goes on, it loses that impetus and it becomes a little bit of a mess, unfortunately. So to give you a good example, like I've been saying, you play as a 14-year-old girl who is naive and sheltered from the world, and the first time she has to kill somebody to survive, it is a very deeply affecting moment, and it's very strongly directed, very strongly presented, and it's a really effective piece. But almost immediately after that, it's like she becomes Tomb Raider and she starts just knocking off people left, right and centre, and doesn't really... There's no more discussion about what she's doing. There's no more kind of visualization of how that's affecting her. It just becomes kind of part of the natural way of things. And that's a good example of, I guess, the way that the game developer has felt that it needs to have those kinds of puzzles in there where she needs to use her slingshot to get past her enemies. But unfortunately, that gameplay element really kind of conflicts with the narrative setting that they've been working so hard to build. It gets even worse later on because she starts to learn all these alchemic abilities. She starts to be able to brew potions that let her knock enemies out, which is one thing, but then she becomes able to brew a potion that will cause an enemy to remove his helmet, which allows her to then throw a slingshot stone at his head and kill him, which works mechanically because it adds additional puzzles that the developer can throw at players in terms of the stealth stuff. So the stealth stuff remains quite varied throughout the whole game as a result. But that kind of thing really conflicts with the realism that the game was going for otherwise. I mean, it's a potion that makes a guy take his helmet off. What is that? It's like it's a magical ability almost, and it's kind of an unreal thing that doesn't really add to the narrative. It actually conflicts with it because firstly it's her being quite aggressive because she only does that when she needs to then kill somebody, and then secondly it's this gamey element that feels more mechanical than it feels like it's part of the narrative. And that's where I have my issues with A Plague Tale. It has these moments where it has these really strong bits of storytelling. It has this vivid imagery. It has this great characterization, it has these great relationships between the characters and everybody they meet, but then again and again and again it lets itself down by becoming very gamey. I don't know necessarily how the developers could have resolved that, because I suspect that if they didn't do all those gaming bits, all the reviews that would be coming back would be saying things to the effect of there's no variety in the gameplay, it gets boring, etc, etc, etc. Or there might even be people that, you know, accuse it of being a walking simulator or something. But what they've done, the way that they've created that variety, really, I feel anyway, really starts to let the game down. The other thing that I think really lets A Plague Tale down in terms of the gamey bits is the crafting elements. You need to be on the constant lookout for all these kinds of materials that you need to upgrade your slingshot, or how much ammunition your belt pouch can hold, and all of that kind of stuff, which of course is the kind of thing that you're expected to put into video games these days as a developer, especially kind of the action-adventure games or the stealth games. You're kind of expected to have these elements, and if you don't, again, you get criticized for being limited in terms of the gameplay. But when you're in this world where when you're in this very dark world where misery is rife, and survival is, well, it's not guaranteed, it's you're kind of scratching to try and survive, to be running around picking up materials and then using those materials to improve your sling and stuff, it just, again, it takes away from the experience. It starts to push players into thinking about this more as a game than its narrative, and it's a direct conflict with the kind of character, because you're meant to be playing as this naive girl, but almost immediately she has the ability to upgrade weapons and things, and it just doesn't fit with her character. Again, the developers have let themselves down by making their experience too gamey, and again, perhaps it is they just feel the pressure. Perhaps they feel like there's this great pressure on them to make their video game a video game, else they'll let a certain group of people down, and it's perhaps a lack of confidence in the story that they're telling, which is unfortunate because the game actually does have a really strong story. With that being said, I've got to compliment the developers for actually knowing the limits of their story. I don't feel like A Plague Tale is too long. A lot of these kinds of video games I do feel like get too long because they're padded out, because the developer feels like they have to make a 30, 40, 50 hour long game, or however long it needs to be. I feel like this one tells a story that it needs to tell and then stops there, which is great. I wish more games did that. It's not short by any means. It's still a good chunky adventure, and it'll still take you a while to get through. And then there's there's difficulty options in the sense that you can choose to play immersive, or you can play with assists on and stuff like that. So there's plenty of value in there. But I feel like it's one of those rare games which has the confidence to finish when it finishes. It doesn't need multiplayer. It doesn't need challenge rooms. It doesn't need all that nonsense. It's a storytelling game, and it's confident with that, which I think is great. I just wish that the developers got the gameplay bits to be a little bit more closely related to the story they were telling, because I feel like that's where it misses out. And I think that's an ongoing challenge for video game developers in general. I feel like this is something that nobody's still quite worked out perfectly yet. We're getting closer, and games like this are certainly an example of that. It's getting better, but at the same time there is still an inherent conflict between the story that you're trying to tell, if it's a serious, mature story with some strong messaging. If you're trying to tell something serious, it still conflicts just that little bit with the gameplay. Anyway, I do hope you do play A Plague Tale: Innocence. I will have a full review up on digitallydownloaded.net, so please do check it out. If you do enjoy my videos, please consider backing me on Patreon so I can do a lot more frequently. That would be great for me, and I hope you do enjoy my videos. But thank you for watching. We will see you at the next one, and yes, enjoy A Plague Tale.